Mainly just a couple things that you'll, one thing you'll need, and then another thing that'll just kind of emphasize or help make your stuff look a little bit fancier. All right, so there's two things that I'm going to cover today. One of them is called SureTarget, and the other one is called Particular. SureTarget is a free plugin that you can get from Video Copilot. So if you go to Google and you type in Video Copilot SureTarget, the top one is going to be the SureTarget 2, which also has the ability to download it right over here. Okay. So I'm going to show real quick how to install SureTarget so that you can utilize it. I'll close all my windows so it's like I never was here. All right. So when you download SureTarget, you're going to get, when you download any After Effects plugins, you basically get, here's the plugins, and then I'm on Windows 64-bit. You'll get this little file, and I believe this is a AEX, yeah, AEX format. Okay, so any After Effects plugins is an AEX format. So all you do is there's no installer like double clicking and just having it do its thing. You actually have to copy a lot of these into the correct spot. And this is going to also base on your computer. If you're on a Mac, it's in a similar spot. It's just a different way to get to that spot. So on a PC, you go to Program Files, you go to Adobe, you find your version of After Effects. So we're using CC 2015. Okay, and then we go to the Support Files, and then we go to Plugins, and we just paste that plugin right there. Okay, so we paste the plugin inside the Plugins folder. All right, on a Mac, it's a similar process. Except on the Mac, you go into the Adobe folder, and there's just, I believe, just that one Adobe clicker thing. And then you have to control click it or right click it and say Show Package Contents, and then you can see the plugins and all the other stuff. Okay, of course, you could just Google how do you install plugins in After Effects on a Mac. There you go. Okay, now the other tool that we're going to be using is Particular. And Particular's on these computers, but for whatever reason, it's not showing up in 2015. But if you go into, you go into CS55, which I'm not even sure why 55 is even on this computer, and you go into the plugins for that, there's Trapcode, so you can copy the Trapcode folder, and you can paste it into your plugins folder for 2015. Okay. And then what that gives you is the ability to use Trapcode, which is a cool plugin, which you'll see. All right. So first thing, let me show you what SureTarget can do. So I'm just going to make a new composition, and I'll keep it small just so it can go a little bit quicker. And let's pretend that we have a composition or a piece of footage here and a piece of footage there. Oops. I want a different piece of footage there, a different piece of footage there, and a different piece of footage there. Okay. So I have these 4 pieces of footage. Right now, it's no big deal if I'm going to move from one to the other. All I would have to do is just create a camera. And right now I have 2D layers, so nothing's going to affect them. They're 2D layers, right? So once I make them 3D layers, they stay in the same spot, but then I can actually spin around them. So if I'm animating this thing, I can go to this one, set some keyframes, go to this one, set some keyframes, go to that one, set some keyframes, go to that one, and set some keyframes. So it's very easy to do that when we have something that's very straightforward like this. But when we get into this state where, you know, this item is actually, further back. And this item is way over here. And this item is really far back. And it's also rotated. Okay, and then that item's just right there. Okay, so when we get into this kind of state, it gets very difficult for our camera to get to that right spot and then transition from one to the other very easily. If I try to go to this one and then go to that one and I'm rotating my camera, you can see how tricky it can be to get that one lined up. Okay, so that's where SureTarget comes in. So the way it works is we make a new null, doesn't matter what you call it, and we go to the Video Copilot SureTarget. Now, a warning is that this plugin was not made for 2015. The plugin was made for 2013, or whatever it was, CS6, and then it was ported into 2015. So what that means for us is that it's not going to work the correct way right now. We actually have to reboot After Effects in order for it to register that it's active. Okay, so I'm just going to set some stuff up before I go. So here's how this works, is that I have these targets down here, and I just pick the order I want them to go into. So I want it to go to number 1, then I want it to go to number 2, then I want it to go to number 3, then I want it to go to number 4. Okay? Now you'll see that it also made a camera here for us. So what this plugin's going to do is it's automatically going to jump us to each one of these spots. Without us having to physically move our camera into position, it just automatically pops us into that spot, which is very, very neat. And I can test this by seeing if I go to the SureTarget and I type in 2, you can see that it didn't move. And it should have moved to that next spot, but it did not. So I'm going to save this scene as my test scene, SureTarget. And then I just close it and I reboot After Effects, and then the plugin will be activated and then the plugin will work. And it's weird why it does that. There's no specific reason. Basically, they just need to rewrite it. I verified the stuff I was showing last class with the expressions. They did change how they write their expressions a bit. So that's why the stuff I was showing, which should have worked, would have worked in 2014, but not have worked in 2015. So there is a little bit of change. I'll have some stuff for that. All right, so now if we look at this, I can say, okay, we're at number 1, then I want to go to number 2. You can see how I jumped to number 2. Now we should go to number 3, and then it goes number 4, and now I'm at number 4. Okay. Now you'll see that they're not kind of lining up perfectly in the center, and the reason for that is because it's based on the shape layer. So if I disable these cameras here, and I just look at the shape layer for this one, you can see that it's over here, but there's actually the indicator is down there. All right. So if I move my pivot to this, and that one obviously is like way off, so I really have to just do all this stuff before I even get to the stage of lining these things up, because now they're just all over the place. And doing it at this point, I'm not 100% sure that this will even allow it to work correctly. We'll find out. There we go. So there's number 4. You can see definitely it's centered better. There's number 3. There's number 2. And there's number 1. Okay. Now you'll see that they're also not rotating. Well, I didn't really rotate them anymore because I changed that. Let's rotate this one a bit. And then if I want to go to that one, you'll see that it's not rotating. I can turn on auto rotate, and it'll actually rotate towards that one. I can also change my color so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. So there's a blue one. There's a green one. And then a yellow one. Okay, so seeing I can turn this auto rotate on, and it'll actually rotate my camera to match those. So now watch how easy it is to animate my camera. So I just go to my null. I'm going to start off on camera 1, or on target 1, and hit yes. Then I'll go up a little bit. Say I want you to then go to number 2. Go up a little bit. Say I want you to go to number 3. Go up a little bit. Then I want you to go to number 4. So now it's automatically going to transition to each one of these spots. And you can see how much easier this is going to be than trying to go through the process of moving your camera and rotating your camera and setting up all these keyframes. Because now we'll have 4 keyframes that we're dealing with. Okay? Much, much simpler. Now here's another cool part that we can do for this too, is that we can do things like dolly. So I can say I want to enable dolly. I'm too far away from this specific one on number 1, so I want to dolly in to help zoom into that shot, or dolly out to pull back of it. Okay? Dollying is just literally like moving in or moving back. That's what that one is. So that's kind of a neat way to, get from point A to point B, is by using that dollying feature. Now the other cool thing that it has is camera roll. So I could actually enable camera rolling and crank this up. Now again, just because the feature is there doesn't mean you have to use it. Consider what it's used for, why you're using it. So in this case, you can see that I'm rolling into each one of these, and it could add a little bit of fun in certain areas, but I definitely wouldn't want to use this in every one, okay? Usually what beginners do is that they turn on every single feature available, and then you end up getting sick and throwing up, and you don't want that to happen, okay? So just be very careful with what you're using these things for. So rolling will actually kind of roll the camera into position instead of just moving it and rotating it into that spot. There's also inertia. So this will, wasn't working on my laptop, but what it should be doing is giving us a little bit more sway past it. Yeah, so this one's, some of these may not work in 2015. The wiggle one, is a nice one, because instead of our camera going from spot to spot and just kind of staying there, it'll actually sway a little bit. So I'm going to add a little bit of a speed, and I'm going to add a little bit of an amount. All right, let me be a little bit more drastic with it. There we go. All right, let me be even more drastic. So what this should be doing is it should be wiggling the camera. I'm going to take that amount really far up. There we go. Okay, so this is the drunk cam.
Look at this. No, leave it at that. Watch it.
All right, so what it does is it wiggles the camera a little bit to give it more of like a homey kind of feel, right? Instead of this computer-generated perfect, movement there. And then changing the speed. Obviously, the lower the number, the slower it's going to go. So you'll still get some of that movement in there, some of that softness and kind of transitional stuff, but it just won't look as much. So again, consider using some of these things, because it's a lot easier to do this tool than to do other stuff.
Somebody should use that if they rate that they like to talk and their camera should shake.
Yes. Now here's the one that I think is really awesome, is this autofocus. And what this allows you to do is do like a depth of field. So I can say I want to focus the targets and do a little depth of field. So now look at that. The ones behind it are actually fuzzy, and the ones in front of it are in focus. So again, that helps us kind of give focus to the item that we're trying to talk about at the moment. Okay. Now at any point, if this stops working, reboot After Effects, and then it'll all kick in. Typically this is like a last-ish kind of step, but we kind of, in our minds, plan for using it. Okay? So it shouldn't be something we're using too long. Now again, we can take the aperture up. That makes things fuzzier. We take it down. It makes them sharper in the backgrounds. We could also change the blur level just to overall soften that a bit. Or harden it a bit. There we go. Okay. Now again, the distance between them will control also how blurry it is. An item really far back is going to be super blurry. An item really close will be pretty clear. Okay. So SureTarget, awesome free plugin from Video Copilot. Definitely check it out. Start playing with it. You really want to be able to control your stuff like that. Okay. Now this one, I'm going from one right to the other one. You typically wouldn't want that to happen, because on each one of these you may have a little animation that plays out, right? So that's where I'm going to go into this. And here's what's awesome about this is I hit U to get the keyframes, and then I say, okay, I want to go from here to that one. So I'm just going to copy that keyframe, go until I'm done with that specific one, and scoot that down. So I can copy this keyframe and paste it, and scoot that over. I can go to this one and copy the keyframe, paste that one. Okay, so each one of these double keyframes here is where I'm holding my camera on those specific spots. So here I'm holding it on my first one. Here I'm holding it on my second one. Here I'm holding it on the third. The fourth one doesn't need a hold because it's already holding. There's not going anywhere afterwards. So now what we're going to get is it's going to hold on each one of these. Because we have that wiggle in there, it's not going to be a static hold. It's going to like wiggle around a little bit.
You're not going to notice it very much.
Right. It's not going to notice very much because I didn't go with the drunk cam. I just went with a little wiggle.
That's my favorite.
Okay, so there we go to 1, then there's 2, then there's 3, and then there's 4. Okay? And again, we have this many keyframes for that whole camera move. Okay? Because this plugin is doing all the other work. So if we needed to change the speed or we needed to change any of those factors, we can do that. Okay? So use SureTarget. It's pretty cool.
Stay on target.
Yes. Now the other thing that I wanted to show was a tool called Particular. Oops, I wanted to go to a new comp. There we go. So for Particular, I need a new solid to drop Particular on. And under trap code, Particular will show up. Now if you didn't copy the plugin from the CS55 folder and put it into the plugins for 2015, on these computers it won't show up. You can't have this plugin at home unless you buy it. You can download the trial, you can use the trial like crazy, and then when you come in here the trial will register, and then you can actually see what your stuff is full blown. If you have just the trial version, you'll get a big X over your stuff. It still updates, but you get a big X over it. Okay? So with Particular, this is all it is. Particles, okay? But we can do a lot with particles. So some of the stuff that we can do is if we go over here, there's 7,000 things here, but we only need to touch on a few. So the first one is the emitter. And this is basically how are the particles getting onto your scene? How is it getting into the world? So right now we have particles per second. We have an emitter type. We have positioning. We have subframe information, direction, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of this, I'm going to go up a little bit. And this is one of the cool things is that it updates automatically. So as I click and drag more, it's automatically going to calculate what that needs. Okay? So you don't want to go all the way to the end of this, really far down, because if I start cranking this number up, it has to calculate from frame 1 all the way to the current frame we're at of how many particles that would look like. So I only went up a little bit. You can see as I get this far down and I start tweaking this, we may not see a huge difference. Yeah. We would see it on a bigger scene. Okay? So we can kind of play with this number and adjust it. Our position is literally where is this thing positioned at? Where is it coming from? Okay? For a lot of things, this is going to be either parented or it's going to be moved to a certain spot or whatever. We also have position Z. So you'll see that it's not actually 3D, but it does kind of fake the 3D look of it. Okay, it has like built-in 3D. And then direction is another important one. Right now it's uniform, it's going outward. Okay, but we can do directional, and then we can control the direction. Where did I see direction? Somewhere I saw direction. Particle shading locks. I don't know. There we go. Well, somewhere there's direction in here. Okay, disk is just round, and then outwards is just outwards. Okay, it's very subtle on some of those. Directional spread. I'll just leave it uniform. Okay, there's also velocity. So this is how fast they're coming out. So the faster they come out, obviously the wider they're going to be. And then they have these random ones. So some of the particles are coming out at 170 miles per hour, whatever you want to call that. And then the other ones are moving at a 20% difference, and then there's ones in between. So if I crank this up, you'll see that some are going to move as fast as that, and some are going to move very, very slow. Okay, so again, you kind of play with these to see different results. This velocity from motion, right now there's no motion on this emitter, so that does no effect at all. I crank this up, and it does nothing right now. But you'll see in my example how that's going to come into play. Stop playing. All right, so this is just how they get into the world. If I change my point emitter to like a box, and I rewind this a little bit, it's actually going to come out of a box. Now the box size is right here. So I make this bigger, I make this bigger, I make that bigger, and I actually have particles coming out of a box. Again, for something like this, it's not really making much sense, but when you change this to be like directional, you can see how now it looks like it's kind of shooting backwards a bit. Okay, and then we can change this to a grid, and then we can rotate it. Okay, so depending on what you're trying to do, that's where you can get this kind of stuff. And that's where the direction is under this rotation, now that I'm remembering. Okay, but here's what the cool one is this layer. Okay, and what the layer means is that I can actually, instead of having dots, I can actually, oops, sorry, not that one. Ignore what I just said. It's points, let's leave that at points. The layer one's gonna come in down here when we're choosing our particle, okay? So now this is what the particle looks like. Right now it's a sphere. Here's where I can tell this to be a sprite, okay? And a sprite is a layer. So I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to draw something like that. Perfect. And then here's, oops, that's a mask. That's not perfect. I thought I clicked off. I'll just do a piece of text. Sean. Not Shauna. It's just Sean. All right, so I have my name here. So under the particle, under sprite, if I look inside this thing under texture, I can put Sean. It says recommended to use text layers for particles. Not recommended. Yeah, whatever. And then as I go here, let's see, is it going to work? It's not going to work. So let's take this and pre-compose it. Move everything into a new composition. Yes. Come on. All right, fine, don't work. I'll just draw something in here. In my other one, I just used a picture. I just thought the text would work too. All right, so here is my text. So here is, or my text, here's my box. So if I zoom in, you can see there's those little boxes growing. Now, again, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't look fancy right now because it's just a box. But if I go to my particles and I change their size, okay, you can see that these are actually the box from the other comp. And if I go into that comp and I started adding other stuff, like let's say I went in here and I added, just so it's obvious, little shapes inside here, then when I come back to this comp, you'll see that now I have all of these faces that are inside there. All right, so not very, useful to have a bunch of faces in there. So let me add something that is actually useful. So the one thing I wanted to do is when I did my cards, and I have my cards kind of flicking out and spinning around, I want to have these particles, but they're cards, okay, also added on there. So I created this composition that has each card on it, okay? So 4 cards, 4 frames long, 1 card at each frame. So I'm going to drop this into this. Okay, and then from my list here, I'm going to choose point. I'm going to choose my cards. Okay, so right now there's my cards really big, and there is. You'll see that it's not showing right now. It's doing current time. So I'm going to say current frame freeze. There we go. So what that does is it goes to, let me turn this layer off, we don't need to see it anymore, is on this layer, on layer 1, or whatever, on frame 1, it goes to this composition, it grabs that first frame, and those are the particles that get emitted. Then it goes to frame 2. Whatever frame 2 looks like in that composition, it shows that. and it goes to frame 3. Whatever frame 3 is, that's what those ones are going to look like, and then frame 4. And that's why after a certain point, I don't have any particles in there because there's no more layers to show up. So the one that I used in my other one was random still frame. And what this is going to do is it's going to pick a random frame from that composition and then emit these cards. So I basically have an unlimited amount of cards without actually having to animate a million cards. Now as I get bigger and bigger on this, you'll see that my system's actually going very slow. Especially when we turn on stuff like motion blur, it's going to go incredibly slow. So while you're working on this, I like to keep this number for particles per second pretty low. That'll help speed things up. Also it recommended, where is my card comp? Here it is. It also recommended not having a texture this big, because as I do this, it's basically duplicating this composition that many times. So having a huge composition duplicated 7,000 times, obviously it's going to slow your station down. So I can always go to my comp settings here and lower this. Right now it's 499 by 666. It's a weird number. I could lower this to 222. And now it's a third of the size, and then just shrink all of these to 33.3332. There we go. That's roughly the correct size. Okay, so now you don't really notice a huge difference, especially when these things are moving very quick, have motion blur. You don't see a difference in quality, but you will see that in time and how long it's going to take for this thing to calculate. Okay, because right now it cached 10 seconds of this. Before, it would have only cached like 3 seconds in the time that it took for that. All right, so again, we just kind of come through and play with things. Random seed, anytime you see the random seed thing, because it's a popular one, what this will do is it'll actually go through and give you different values. So if I change this to a 2, you'll see that my cards are going to change. Okay, it's kind of like when it makes a bunch of random choices, but you don't like those random choices, it just gives you a different set of random choices. Okay, so in this one I might get more red, in this one I might get more black. Okay, so you just kind of pick through those if you want to. You could actually animate those too if you wanted to animate those, but typically you don't. All right, cool. Then we have rotation. So I could also go through and say rotate them. So that as these things are moving, you'll see that they're also rotated a bit instead of just being perfectly straight. I could also randomize the rotations a bit. Okay. I could also do some size randomizing. So some cards are huge, some cards are small. I could randomize their opacity if I want to do that.
Look at this dream you had about this thing.
There's shading too, so I can add, some shading on top of them.
Does it work?
I have to add lights in the scene. I don't have lights in the scene, so I'm just going to leave the shading off for now, just for speed. Okay, but there's a lot of stuff that we can do with this. And again, you're not going to watch me go through everything and remember everything I'm doing. The best thing is to just kind of get a plan of here's what I want to happen. Now let's work towards making that thing happen. So I'm going to jump to my thing over here. Okay, so here it is without the particles and without motion blur, and with me kind of framed in a little bit better. There we go. So I wanted the cards to kind of like a magic trick where they kind of flip and they're changing suit, and then it says card player, and then that goes away. Okay, but every time that the card hit or flipped or spun, I wanted to add some particles in there to help that transition along. So I added my particles. So let me rewind it. Let me hit play. And that's with that motion on there, that inherent motion, because what it's doing is it's figuring out how fast this object is moving, because it's parented to it, and then it's kind of moving along with it. Okay, so boom, right there. It actually moves along, and so when it hits, it's continuing that direction. It's saying just kind of like shoot the particles that way. Okay, so you can see how that adds a bit more to the scene than just having it as the cards themselves. Okay, and then when you add motion blur on top of this, holy cow. Okay, you can see the look that we get with this. It adds, again, another level of kind of neatness to the whole mix. And again, this isn't something where I just went in there and punched in the exact values. You have to play with it. You have to say, okay, I want this thing to happen. Let me play with the settings until I get that. That's good. Now let me play with the next setting and try to get something else to happen. Okay? So let me jump back to this one, and I'm going to show that inherit velocity from, it's hard to see because I scrunched it, motion. Okay? So if I go to this item here, and what I want to do is I want to parent this thing. So I want to be able to move this emitter around, okay, without having to do that. I want to grab an object and have it follow that object around. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'll just draw a little mask in it right here. Perfect. So right now there's my layer, okay? And if I want my particles to follow this layer, I can parent the whole layer to it, but that's not really going to give me the same effect, okay? By parenting a layer to this one, and let me rename these so this makes more sense. Particles, gray block, okay? If I parent my particles to the gray block, and then I animate my gray block moving around, what we're going to see is that the entire layer moves. It's kind of like a really fake animation, right? It doesn't look like the particles are actually moving. That picture of the particles is moving around. It's kind of like the bouncing picture you have as your Windows screensaver kind of thing. Okay, now if that was actually moving, why aren't you moving now? There it goes. So you can see that the particles don't do anything different. They're just kind of going along for the ride, but they're not doing anything substantially different, okay? So this parenting is not going to work that way, okay? This is where expressions are going to come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my effects, go to my particular, go to my emitter, and I'm going to alt-click. You'll see that there's a position XY and there's a position Z. So I'm going to alt-click on this one, and then I'm going to drag this little noodle to my position. And what that does is it writes the expression so that my particles will actually follow that piece. And you'll see that as it gets to those corners, now it does kind of float a little bit further. Now let me turn this off. Pause. Let me turn this off a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to take my velocity down some. So let's go to like 10. Okay. So we have very little velocity movement now. But you can see how when it does hit that corner, how we're getting a bit more movement. Now let me crank this up, and we'll really see it. Okay, because now it's following the movement of it. It's saying you're moving this way, I'm going to start emitting in that direction. And again, this is something, again, you have to play with. Let me shrink this in. There we go. Okay. So again, we just kind of play with the setting until we get it to happy values. All right. So that works great when it's just X and Y. But now we add Z into the mix. So now this is a 3D layer, and it's also going to be moving backwards. So I'm going to go to this position and really crank the Z really far back. And I'll go to this position and crank the Z really forward. Okay. So now if we look at this, it doesn't really look like we're getting the Z depth of this, which we're not, okay? My emitter is going up and down, left and right, but it's not going in the depth direction. So I have to go down to my position, and I can alt-click this one and do my little noodle, come on, and grab it just on the Z, okay? And now just the Z is connected to that one. So now if we watch this, you'll see how now we're getting the effect of it following it off in the distance. Okay? Now the last thing that I did with this one was I didn't want particles emitting the entire time. I only wanted particles emitting at certain spots. When the card flicked down, I wanted particles to emit. So that's where I came into the emitter and I turned it on. All right? So I'm going to go here and say this thing's going to get to right about there. So I'm going to turn this off. Set a keyframe, go up a couple frames, put it to like 15 or 500 or something ridiculous. There we go. Go up a couple more frames, and then turn it off again. Okay, so what should happen is right when it hits, it emits 1,500 particles, and then that's it, or so. Okay, and then when it hits the front, I do the same thing. Boom, right there. And I could even copy these and paste them down here. Maybe scoot them over a touch. Okay, and again, you have to play with this because what happens sometimes is that your keyframes don't line up with the movement right. And so when it hits, then it turns on, there's no movement happening, so that motion doesn't follow it. Or that. You see how it kind of trailed? That looked funky. I want it to go boom and hit forward, so that's obviously a bit too far up. I'm going to just scoot it back a touch. Boom. Boom. Okay, so it's there. It's probably like way out. So if I were to hit U to hide everything, and I created a camera, and I zoomed out a bit, and you'll see that these are actually like 3D. They're floating out in space. So now we hit it, boom, and then it comes up, boom, and it hits there. Okay, so now we're able to zoom in a touch more so we can actually see that one. All right, so we hit the back, boom, and then hit the front, right there. Bunch of cards, bunch of cards. Okay? So again, a cool way that you can add some realism to your scene. So if you had something like a blip and you wanted the blip to happen, but then you wanted something else to happen on top of that, obviously you could do some very quick stuff like that. Okay? And then the final thing I wanted to touch on was just think about where your stuff is at and where you actually need these things. Don't try to keep all of your timelines like full. You don't need your timelines to be full. Consider what your clip is and only use what's in your clip. So if I had a quick blip, let me make a quick blip. Okay, so I'm just going to scale this. Let's say it's at 0. Oops, I need more time in here. Actually, let me go 30 seconds. All right, so it's at 0. I set a keyframe. I'm going to go up a couple frames. I'm going to scale it huge. And then shrink it back down to 0.
Oh.
Okay, so it's a ridiculous blip, I know, but this is just to test it out. Okay, so we just have this really funky blip for whatever reason. And you'll see that the blip is gone. It starts, and then it's gone. Now I have all this extra space inside my composition that I don't need, okay? So what I want to do is I want to cut it. I want to shrink this down. Because what's going to happen is this is called comp 4. Called weird blip. If I go to my actual end comp here, I have too many comps open now, so stuff's like hidden. That's there. There it is. And I drop this weird comp inside here, you can see how big this is going to be. And then my blip happens, and then it's gone. Okay? Now, even though there's nothing on the scene, After Effects is still checking this layer every single time we update to see if it's still empty. Okay? So we don't want that to happen. So what we should do in every composition setting is figure out where the end of this is, right there, and then set the end key for the end of our composition, trim the comp to the work area, and now we just have this clip that is just that. Now the cool thing about this also is that, let me close this one, is that as we know that this is only this long, okay, now we could take this and position it exactly where we need it. So I need it, let's say, right here. So there it is, and then it's gone. Not that it would be there, but you get the idea. Okay? And then we could duplicate it and use it somewhere else. So I say, well, I may need it down here too. And then down there, there's that blip again. Okay? So think about that we're not just creating a blip for this one spot, but we're creating the blip as an asset that we could reuse over and over and over again. So if we have those little bursts or those little transitions, we may want to reuse those over and over, even if we decided we wanted them to be in a different position, a different scale, a different rotation, or even a different color. Okay? So we can change these things and kind of use them over and over and over again and repurpose them instead of trying to recreate all this stuff multiple times. Okay? Make sure as you're going through your stuff, you are looking at the tangents of your stuff. You're looking at the keyframes, and everything isn't set to just like this one is. Everyone's not set to just these linear ones. That you're actually going through these things and at least setting them to easy ease so that we have a transition there. So, not a transition, but we have some nice smoothing going on with the motion. It's not boom, done, right? We want to have that transitional stuff so that we do have some acceleration, so we do have some smoothing out. And then make sure you're doing that. Is that it? All right, that's the only thing I can think of. Yeah. Oh, motion blur. Make sure you're using motion blur too, because obviously that's a huge thing that blends our stuff together and makes it look like it's a lot quicker. There's a huge difference in my playing cards one when I don't have motion blur turned on. That looks very, I mean, it's okay, but turning motion blur on really adds to the speed of it. It really makes it feel like it's going fast as opposed to just something moving, especially when these things fly in like this. Like that. It's really neat how it does that. Okay? So just keep all of that stuff in mind as you're working on these pieces. The best thing to do, keep a checklist of all these things that I'm saying, you know, check this and check that, and try to incorporate these things as you go, or every day you kind of come in and go through the checklist. Am I still doing this? Am I still doing this? Because it's very easy to forget when you start setting keyframes and have all this stuff kind of stacked on top of each other. And also don't be afraid to just wipe something and do it again, or make a new composition and try something else. I tried 3 different animations on these cards before I found one that I actually liked. Okay? Our planning kind of helps us do that, but it doesn't always get there. Sometimes our vision on paper is different than our vision in the computer once we start animating these things. All right, save my weird project. All right, so that's it. So check out SureTarget, check out Particular, very cool plugins, and that's it.